Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Our adventure tonight will take us to ancient Egypt again, 3,500 years ago, at the time of an unusual monarch in the history of Egypt, the time of the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh. When asked about the Queen of Egypt, the name of Cleopatra may come to mind first. And Cleopatra was a relevant historical figure. But she reigned 1,500 years after Hatshepsut, and she was the last queen of a foreign dynasty founded by a Greek general, Ptolemy, after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Hatshepsut lived long before that, at a time when Egypt was the great power of the Middle East, a rare beacon of advanced civilization in the world. And her reign was peaceful, prosperous, and on many counts successful, rather than chaotic and ultimately tragic like Cleopatra's. This extraordinary life, this reign, and this period of Egyptian history is what we will explore tonight. But first, allow me to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to 16 exclusive episodes, our latest one being about the Loch Ness Monster. And we add a new one every month, and you can download all of our episodes with and without background sounds. We offer advance releases to our patrons as well. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, let's travel back in time 35 centuries to discover Egypt at the time of the 18th Dynasty, near the peak of its splendor and power. Egypt in the 15th century BC was living one of the best periods of its long history. Best in the sense that it dominated its neighbors, its frontiers were safe, and it was politically stable. The central power of the pharaohs was not seriously challenged. We know this not just thanks to the documents and accounts left of this period. We also see it in an intense period of building. An abundant production of art and crafts in the opening and reopening of trade routes, as we will see during the reign of Hatshepsut. So there is an abundance of signs that Egypt was doing well at the time, and it had not always been the case. As you know, there were ups and downs along the very long history of ancient Egypt. As a civilization, it lasted for more than 3,000 years. The usual way of structuring the chronology of Egyptian history is to split the timeline into different periods. It started with an early dynastic period when Egypt emerged from prehistory, and the first period of unification and relative prosperity began in the 3rd millennium BC, a period called the Old Kingdom. There were 3 of these periods of unity that are typically considered high points in the history of Egypt because the country was unified under a single ruler. Generally, it faced no major crisis during this period, no invasions, no lasting period of dislocation or civil war, and this allowed the Egyptian pharaohs and the elite of society to prosper, to build and enjoy the blooming of their culture, of their art, and their lifestyle. The majority of the spectacular monuments that Egypt left were built during these periods of unity. So the first of these periods is the Old Kingdom, which lasted for about 500 years in the 3rd millennium BC. The Old Kingdom was the period when the largest pyramids were built, a practice that receded later. The second of these periods is the Middle Kingdom, which lasted about 3 centuries at the start of the 2nd millennium BC. And finally, the third one was the New Kingdom, 5 centuries in the second half of the 2nd millennium. In between these periods, there were intermediate periods of domination by invaders or disunity. The Egyptian civilization did not stop in these periods. In many respects, society went on, stayed as it had been. But these intermediate periods did not produce major monuments or memorable rulers. There were periods of relative decline when it came to the Egyptian state, its military, and the capacity of Egypt to project power beyond the valley of the Nile. Following the end of the New Kingdom period in the 11th century BC, Egypt entered a prolonged period of decline and diminishing influence. There were various attempts to restore the power of ancient Egypt, but they all failed, and the country fell prey to various invaders like the Babylonians, the Persians, later the Greeks. This was when the Ptolemaic dynasty appeared. And finally, after the failure of this dynasty to preserve its independence, the country fell to the Romans, who turned it into a Roman province. During the Roman period, the culture of ancient Egypt faded quickly. Christianity ended up replacing the old religion. Cultural expression and everyday life in Egypt had been intertwined with beliefs for thousands of years. Even the economy was structured partly around the temples, and all this collapsed into oblivion in the first centuries of our era. The culture, the religion, the social organization, what made the distinctive traits of ancient Egyptian civilization, disappeared. But 1,500 years earlier, in the New Kingdom, the period that is going to interest us tonight, this final collapse would have been really hard to imagine because Egypt shined more than ever at the time. In between the Middle and the New Kingdom, there had been one of these intermediate periods of fragmentation and invaders from the Middle East. A people, or a collection of peoples called the Hyksos, had entered the north of Egypt and occupied it, taking the opportunity to gain these new lands thanks to the void of power in Egypt. Several generations passed like this, and the new kingdom started when a faction, a dynasty from the south, from Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is the south, Lower Egypt is the north, where the Nile turns into the delta and reaches the Mediterranean Sea. So this dynasty from the south revolted against the rule of the Hyksos, and after years of war reconquered all of Egypt. When the country was reunified, its capital stayed in the south, in Thebes, the city of origin of the new dynasty of the new masters of Egypt. Thebes is a Greek name. The Egyptians knew this city as Waset, and the modern city that exists, where lie the ruins of Waset, is called Luxor. So Thebes, or Waset, remained the capital of Egypt for several centuries after the beginning of the New Kingdom. Before the New Kingdom, Thebes had had its importance. During the Middle Kingdom, it had been a respectable city already and had received several monuments like the Temple of Karnak or the mortuary temple of a pharaoh, Mentuhotep II. But after that, it had declined for centuries. The success of this southern dynasty and this new status as capital of Egypt completely reversed the situation for Thebes. It turned it into a thriving capital with spectacular monuments and royal palaces. What remains today of this long period of prosperity in Luxor are the buildings made of stone mainly. There are temples like Karnak, the Temple of Luxor, and on the other bank of the Nile, the one symbolically dedicated to the dead. There is the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, and several mortuary temples. One was built by Ramesses II. He was also a pharaoh from the New Kingdom. And another mortuary temple, a very particular temple that looks like no other. It is at the foot of a high cliff, but instead of trying to compete with it, it complements the cliff horizontally with ramps and terraces. These elements were not new in Egyptian architecture, but the way they were combined to create this temple is rather unique. The temple in a site called Deir-el-Bahari is one of the most famous monuments of ancient Egypt, and it is also the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Even if its ruins are impressive, it is only the shadow of what it used to look like. A lot of it was destroyed after the death of Hatshepsut. We'll see why. And also, it was poorly restored in the 20th century. But we will return to this temple later in our adventure. So this long explanation was to tell you what the New Kingdom was and the importance of Thebes for Egypt in the second half of the second millennium BC. Thebes is going to be the setting of our story tonight. This is where Hatshepsut spent most of her life, and the place from where she ruled over millions. The capital That was not as spectacular at the time as it would become because she lived near the beginning of the new kingdom. But she turned out to be one of the major contributors to the embellishment of Thebes, not only with her temple on the West Bank. Like other pharaohs, she commissioned a lot of buildings and improvements to temples to show off her power, to leave a trace and consolidate her position on the throne. But first, let's rewind a bit and start talking about what we know of Hatshepsut. Who was she? And how did a woman end up on a throne that was apparently reserved for men? Hatshepsut was born a princess, probably the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his main wife, Ahmose. And I say probably because there is always a little doubt when it comes to filiation and records in ancient Egypt. The entire story I'm going to tell you actually is based on reasonable guesses by Egyptologists, based on different sources that are recouped, inscriptions on walls, on monuments, text on papyrus. But a lot are incomplete. A lot were lost. And what kings and queens of ancient Egypt had written about them was not always the truth. So bear in mind that all of this is likely but not 100% guaranteed, and this is why I will often use the conditional. So I said main wife about her, Ahmose, because pharaohs could have several wives and countless concubines. They would typically have many children, but the great royal wife was the most important spouse. She had preeminence over all the others, as did her children. And the great royal wife had different official functions. They would also often be of royal blood themselves. The ancient Egyptians believed that avoiding a dilution of royal blood was very important. They saw pharaohs as half gods, and for that reason, the taboo of incest and having children between siblings was lifted for the royal family. Not for the rest of society, but for the royals an exception was made. It is not impossible that Hatshepsut's mother, Ahmose, was the sister of Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I. We don't exactly know. Ahmose is sometimes referred to with the title king's sister, but this may not mean she was his biological sister. This title of sister was also used for wives in relation to their husband. But in any case, there is no doubt that Hatshepsut was born as royal and as sacred as a little girl could be in ancient Egypt at the time. She was the daughter of a pharaoh and his great royal wife, meaning that her blood was precious, almost perfect. It carried royalty. And certainly for that reason, after her father's death in 1493 BC, she was married to her own half-brother, Thutmose II. It was probably even more important to marry Hatshepsut and Thutmose II because Thutmose was the son of a pharaoh and a lesser wife, not the son of Ahmose. Presumably, Thutmose I and Ahmose did not have a son, and this is why the son of a lesser wife was chosen as the successor. He was the backup plan. So maybe his blood was not considered as perfect, as pure as Hatshepsut's, which made this marriage particularly desirable to preserve the quality of the bloodline. Hatshepsut and Thutmose II were both 14 or 15 when this marriage happened, and they became at the same time half-brother and half-sister and spouses. Little is known about Thutmose II. In the history of Egypt, he was completely overshadowed by his father and his successors, including Hatshepsut. Thutmose I, the father, was a glorious ruler. He was on the throne for 12 years, which was not extremely long, but he had time to campaign extensively and push the borders of Egypt farther than ever before, to the south in Nubia and to the northeast in the Levant. These were the two traditional areas of expansion for Egypt. Thutmose I was also the first pharaoh, apparently, to commission a tomb for himself in the Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Thebes. This started a tradition that lasted for generations of pharaohs. In contrast, the reign of Thutmose II was really unremarkable, and there is still a debate between experts about how long it lasted. His reign did not leave major traces on monuments, possibly because they were usurped, diverted by his successors, including by Hatshepsut. That was common practice. We will come back to that. Generally, a reign of 13 years is attributed to him, but this is contested, and some think it was much shorter than that, based on clues like the number of scarabs found with the name of each pharaoh. And what does this mean? It was traditional to make scarabs as amulets and ornaments with the name of the reigning pharaoh on them. And these little objects were not significantly enough to be usurped by pharaohs. So the quantity of scarabs found on archaeological sites with the name of a pharaoh gives a hint of how long the reign lasted. If it was short, there was not going to be many. This kind of evidence is not perfect, of course. For whatever reason, the number of scarabs made could have increased or decreased, but it gives a clue. And here the limited number of scarabs bearing the name of Thutmose II points to a short reign of a few years, maybe only 3 or 4 years instead of 13. So it is still a debated question. How long Thutmose II lived and reigned? But what is more certain is that there were no big accomplishments during his reign. It seems he suppressed a rebellion in the south, in Nubia, after his accession. These rebellions, when there was a change of pharaoh, were rather common at the time, but we don't know anything more about his decisions or character. He had one son, though not with Hatshepsut, but with a secondary wife or a concubine, a woman named Iset or Aset. This son, Thutmose III, was a toddler. He was aged only 2 when Thutmose II died, and as the laws of succession required, Thutmose III became the new pharaoh. To Hatshepsut, the widowed great royal wife, this 2-year-old was the son of her dead husband with another woman, but also the son of her half-brother, her nephew. And because she was the great royal wife, and he was not of age to reign yet, the logical outcome of this situation was a regency under her command that would ensure the continuity of the state until Thutmose III would be of age to reign and command by himself. This is how Hatshepsut became queen regent, which is to say, a queen with the right to make decisions and assume power, but only temporarily, and in the name of a king who was too young to do it himself. This figure of a queen regent is not extraordinary in history. It is quite common. There were queen mothers acting as regents before in the history of Egypt. What is much less common is how this regency evolved. Thutmose III had become the new pharaoh in 1479 BC, aged 2. 7 years later, at most, when he was 9, Hatshepsut had assumed the position of pharaoh instead of him. We know nothing of this rise from queen regent to queen regnant at the expense of her nephew. We only know that around 1479, and for 20 more years, that is to say, until the rightful male heir was 24 approximately, Hatshepsut stayed on the throne as a monarch of Egypt. Moreover, she fully embraced all the traditional regalia and symbols of pharaonic authority, including the sacred crown and ceremonial scepters, establishing herself as a true sovereign rather than merely a figurehead. She had portraits made in paintings and statues as a male pharaoh, and she was referenced as the Pharaoh of Egypt in all official documents. We know this happened, but we barely know anything about the circumstances. We can only imagine or speculate about them. What we know is the starting situation in 1479. She was 18 at the time, and Thutmose II had just died. We ignore the kind of relations Hatshepsut and Thutmose II could have had, if they liked each other or not. This was not really relevant in such a marriage. And in any case, with her husband out of the picture, she was now queen regent for her nephew, a nephew that was also the son of her dead husband with another woman. Maybe she liked the taste of power that she experienced as the regent, and she wanted to stay in place for longer. Maybe she had been raised with her father, Pharaoh Thutmose I, or other people around her, playing with the idea that she could become pharaoh because she was particularly capable. Maybe for whatever reason, like their economic interests, there were influential people at the court around her who wanted her on the throne rather than Thutmose III, because it served their interests. Anything can be imagined, but nothing is proven. It is tempting to imagine that this progressive seizing of power was achieved thanks to her strong will, abilities, and machinations. Maybe. But we don't know for sure. It could also be that the royal court around her wanted her on the throne rather than Thutmose III, and the young boy would have been sidelined for that reason. In any case, it happened, and retroactively, the beginning of her reign as pharaoh was backdated on the monument she commissioned to year 1 of the reign of Thutmose III, which showed that she really had taken the throne for herself. Was it really a first to see a woman seizing the throne for an extended period of time and out of a period of regency? Not exactly, actually. Hatshepsut was the most spectacular example, but it had happened before. It had happened in the mid-18th century BC with a female pharaoh named Sobekneferu. Sobekneferu lived about 280 years before Hatshepsut, and she ascended to the throne at a time of disruption. The Middle Kingdom was ending, and for 2 centuries there would be a period of fragmentation and loss of independence. This intermediate period with the Hyksos that I mentioned before, until the restoration of the New Kingdom. So, Sobekneferu was the last ruler of her dynasty, the 12th dynasty, and she was on the throne for less than 4 years, but she did reign. Politically, she was not a very important pharaoh, and like many others, she was more an obscure ruler at a time of decadence. But still, her name remained on lists of kings and the limited remains of her reign. Bits of statues and inscriptions tell us that she adopted the full list of titles that male pharaohs used at the time. She had at least one sister, Neferupta, and the records about Neferupta, the sister, strongly suggest that she was educated. She was groomed to become a female pharaoh, which didn't happen, maybe because she died before, but it happened to her sister, Sobekneferu. They were both daughters of a reigning pharaoh, Amenemhat III, and this makes it likely that the decision to have a woman succeed him on the throne had been taken before it happened. It was not a coup that Sobekneferu organized after her father's death. But Sobekneferu has been almost forgotten as a historical figure because her reign was short. We know close to nothing specific about it except that it took place. And given that she reigned just at a time when the 12th dynasty was in steep decline, Egypt was entering a period of chaos. It was not a particularly glorious or successful reign either. So her figure is not very evocative. She's not famous, but she was a female pharaoh before Hatshepsut, and like her, she had the titles and supposed prerogatives of pharaohs. We don't know of other earlier female pharaohs, but there were older possible female rulers of Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC, during the Old Kingdom and before. The very first name during the 1st dynasty that takes us around 2950 BC, 5,000 years ago, was Merit-Neith, a queen that could have been the great-grandmother of the very first pharaoh of unified Egypt, Narmer. It is established with a good grade of certainty that Merit-Neith was a regent. But it is also supposed, based on several records, that she may have also effectively ruled Egypt as a queen regnant. It is unproven that she did it as a pharaoh. We don't know whether she was ever represented or titled as one, but she could have actually ruled the country out of a period of regency. If true, that would make her the earliest known queen regnant in recorded history in the entire world, 5,000 years ago, when not a single one of the great monuments of the world had been built, not even the pyramids of Giza. But this is very speculative. Not her existence, but the reality of the power and title she would have had. Another slightly later candidate from the 5th dynasty, we are now during the Old Kingdom 4,500 years ago, is a queen called Setibohr. She is a little-known queen of the 5th dynasty, The Fifth Dynasty reigned in the 25th and 24th centuries BC, and now we are a few generations after the building of the Great Pyramids. Setibohr was the main wife of a pharaoh, but she could have become more than that, and this hypothesis comes from the unusually large size of her pyramid, her tomb, and also how her monuments were targeted for destruction or appropriation by later rulers. This suggests that maybe she could have had more power and actually ruled the country. The targeting of monuments or their appropriation by erasing the name and replacing it with another one. This is not necessarily something that happened because she was a woman. It was common practice when a pharaoh died to steal his accomplishments and appropriate monuments. New wings or chapels or embellishments offered to temples, just by changing the name of their commissioner. This happened a lot, including between pharaohs of the same dynasty. Hatshepsut did it, and after her reign, she was subject to it too. Maybe there was a particular rejection of female pharaohs because this was not usual, and political and military power was traditionally the domain of men in ancient Egypt. But the targeting of their monuments is not the ultimate proof of that. It happened to everyone. The monuments of Hatshepsut were also degraded by her successors, starting with Thutmose III, when he could finally take the reins of power. And a century ago, Egyptologists believed that this was a consequence of the rejection of a female pharaoh in a male-dominated society. But this view has been mitigated a lot since then. It is unsure that Hatshepsut's monuments were targeted that much more than those of male pharaohs, and it is not easy to distinguish what was the rejection of this figure of a reigning queen and what could have been the rejection of her as a person by her nephew. Because, after all, she had stayed in power for more than 20 years at his expense. Based on the rules of succession of the 18th Dynasty, she had usurped power. But we don't know anything specific about the personal relation between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Maybe they got along well, and he was happy to share power with her. Or maybe he hated her and he couldn't wait to take back what he saw as rightfully his. If it was this second option, we cannot rule out that he ordered the erasure of her name in many places as revenge against her as a person, not because she was a woman. We don't know more about that than what material evidence tells us, and the narrative behind the relations between these historical figures is left to our imagination. So returning to Setibohr, this queen of the Fifth Dynasty, she may also have reigned despite the absence of formal proof, because her pyramid was unusually large and her name was targeted more than usual. One last possible ruler, also speculative, is a queen called Nitocris, who would have been the last queen of the Sixth Dynasty. This is now towards the end of the Old Kingdom in the 22nd century BC. The existence of the previous queens I mentioned is rather well established, but that of Nitocris is much more controversial because her name only appears in records that are dated to many centuries after her death. We don't have contemporary records, and this made a lot of Egyptologists suspect that she was legendary rather than historical. The first Greek historians, for example, attributed the third pyramid of Giza, smaller than the first two, to Nitocris. But this is completely ruled out by modern historians. They attribute that pyramid to Menkaure, a king of the 4th dynasty. So Nitocris is uncertain, but with all the precautions required, if she was real, she could have reigned sometime in the 22nd century BC and be a precursor to Hatshepsut and Sobekneferu. Real or not, all these queens had a few traits in common. If we exclude Hatshepsut, short reigns of a few years at most, and at times of decline, of disruption, Nitocris would have lived at the end of the 6th dynasty, which corresponds to the collapse, the dislocation of the Old Kingdom, and Sobekneferu, who is real and documented, lived at the end of the Middle Kingdom. So this suggests that women could arrive on the throne at times of political or military collapse, which would reinforce the feeling that it was accidental and only possible in times of trouble. Hatshepsut is unique in this sense. She took the title and the prerogatives of a pharaoh for a long time, not for a few years only, and at a time of prosperity and success for Egypt. She didn't end her dynasty, but she reinforced it. And when Thutmose III took the reins of the country, a country in very good shape, he used it to become the greatest conqueror of the 18th century. So she transmitted to him a wealthy, powerful, and competent kingdom with a potent war machine that he could use to expand Egypt well beyond its historical borders. On all accounts, political, military, economic, what we know of the reign of Hatshepsut could be called successful. So let's examine what she did during these 20 years as a pharaoh. First, how do we know her reign was a prosperous period? It can be deduced from mainly two things. First, there were no important conflicts on the borders or inside. No trace, no mention of war during these 20 years can be found. There were certainly police operations on the frontiers or raids to keep in check peoples that at the time were subjugated by Egypt in the Levant and in Nubia. But we can be confident that no big destructive conflict happened during her reign, and by default, Egypt tended to prosper when its economy was not perturbed. This is confirmed by a second thing, the building activity. Hatshepsut turned out to be one of the most prolific builders in ancient Egypt. Her most spectacular works were in Thebes, like her temple, or the works she commissioned at the temple of Karnak. But throughout Egypt, north and south, she also commissioned hundreds of projects, temples, chapels in existing temples, restoration of crumbling buildings or monuments. This indicates she had the means to order so much work, and it couldn't have happened in an impoverished country. So why this urge to build like this? Like all pharaohs, to leave a mark, but also for more practical political reasons to affirm her power. When a new temple was inaugurated or an older temple reopened afterwards, the pharaoh, or at least an envoy, would show up to perform rituals. The rituals reserved for pharaohs, and by doing this they provided a visible proof of their existence, of who they were. We can imagine that the visit of a pharaoh in a place was something extraordinary for the people. First, because people certainly never saw so much refinement with jewels, clothes, all the pageantry that surrounded the pharaoh constantly. And this visit was the closest thing to a god visiting the world for them. It was an event that people certainly remembered for the rest of their lives, maybe more than for others, than for her male predecessors. Hatshepsut needed to do that, to commission religious buildings to visit them, to show how real she was, to affirm her power. Because it is likely that a female pharaoh raised eyebrows. It was unusual. Actually, in her representation in statues, Hatshepsut asked to be represented as a male pharaoh with attributes that never appeared on women, like the false beard that pharaohs typically wore, or ram's horns. Symbolically, with these signs of masculinity, she was probably trying to convey that she happened to be first and foremost a pharaoh in a woman's body. We don't know what she thought of it, whether she believed that women should be allowed to govern, or she somehow saw herself as an exception, a woman with the soul of a man. This rhetoric of a woman with a masculine soul or a masculine heart is something that comes back in history when Queen Regent stayed in power for a long time. It was also said of Elizabeth I in England, or Catherine the Great in Russia, for example. Maybe it was just a way of making it acceptable to have a woman controlling power when it was traditionally the property of men. In any case, it is likely that the intense building activity during Hatshepsut's reign was, for a part at least, a way of consolidating her power. But the capital contained her grandest works, the Temple of Karnak on the Nile's eastern shore, and additional construction on the western bank, a region traditionally linked to death because it is where the sun sets. Karnak is not just a temple. It was a temple complex with a multiplicity of temples, chapels, shrines, and other buildings, and it was probably the most important religious site or center in Egypt during the New Kingdom. We saw before how the importance of Waset of Thebes increased during the New Kingdom because it was the base of the dynasty that reconquered Egypt from the south, the 17th Dynasty, that was quickly replaced by the 18th Dynasty after the reconquest. Under the 18th Dynasty, the country rebuilt itself. A lot of old monuments were restored. Many more were built, and Egypt also expanded abroad. That's why the 18th Dynasty, of which Hatshepsut is a part, is considered one of the most successful and a peak for ancient Egypt. In Thebes, the main local god was Amun. In the rest of Egypt, Amun was not completely unknown, but was a secondary deity. It received little devotion in other places, even though the influence of his cult had begun to expand beyond Thebes during the Middle Kingdom. The fortune of the cult of Amun completely changed with the New Kingdom. Amun was now the god of the new pharaohs, the main cult in the capital of Egypt. And with it, the cult of Amun grew dramatically all across the country, to the point that later Amun even absorbed other deities. His cult merged with part of the cult of the sun, Ra. and a godly figure called Amun-Ra was worshipped. The success of a cult meant offerings from the people and enormous favors from the pharaohs or the high nobles of the country. There was an economic dimension to it. During the New Kingdom, no site was as favored as Karnak by successive pharaohs. This turned the Temple of Karnak into an economic powerhouse. There were the offerings, of course, but the temple also owned land, cattle, workshops, because temples were important economic units in Egypt, and Karnak was at the time probably the most powerful and wealthiest of them. The peak time of Karnak was during the New Kingdom, but it had started centuries earlier in the Middle Kingdom, and construction went on until the Ptolemaic period, the Greek period, at the end of the history of ancient Egypt. So the temple or the complex of Karnak was active for close to 2,000 years before it really was abandoned. And nowadays its remains are among the most spectacular ruins visible in Egypt. Hatshepsut's contribution to Karnak included 2 obelisks. These high vertical monuments made of a single block, a shard of stone. At the time, they were the highest ever, and one is still standing at Karnak. She also offered a shrine called the Red Chapel, and plenty of other restorations or smaller interventions in the perimeter of the temple. Many were usurped by others who put their name on them. But the most spectacular work she commissioned was her own mortuary temple on a site called Deir-el-Bahari. What is a mortuary temple, actually? It was not a tomb, but a special temple adjacent or close to a royal tomb, a temple that would survive the pharaoh and be dedicated to its cult after his death, or, in the case of Hatshepsut, her death. This mortuary temple stands out in ancient Egyptian architecture. It uses a cliff as a backdrop, and it spreads horizontally at the foot of the cliff. This is why many pictures of this temple are aerial pictures. But people saw it from the ground, and what they saw was this succession of terraces connected by ramps, with lines of columns and statues slowly rising in front of them, until the cliff took off like a connection between earth and heavens. That was certainly a striking vision for people who were not used to seeing the landscape being used like this in architecture. It was not a complete first, though. There was already a smaller temple on the side, the temple of Mentuhotep II, a pharaoh from the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, who also came from Thebes. But Thebes had not remained the capital for long during the Middle Kingdom. This monument remained maybe in a poor state because it was 500 years old when Hatshepsut started hers, unless it had been restored. In any case, part of the inspiration for her temple came from this smaller adjacent building, the ramps and the lines of columns. Nowadays, Hatshepsut's temple looks very dry and mineral. It was not always the case. The perimeter was irrigated. There was a lot of greenery, too. So at the foot of this cliff, what people saw was the mix of trees, of green plants, and the warm yellow of the limestone, the vibrant colors of the statues probably, all this overlooked by the ochre reddish cliff. For ancient Egyptians, this must have been a vision of perfection and a celebration of life that evoked the afterlife for them. That was certainly the intention. In the gardens of the foot and on the terraces of the temple, there would have been myrrh trees, brought back from afar from the land of Punt. The land of Punt is a somewhat mysterious kingdom or region in Africa that appeared in Egyptian records, and it was probably somewhere on the African coast of the Red Sea, where Eritrea is nowadays. In the Middle Kingdom, there had been commercial links between Egypt and this land of Punt, known to provide gold, ivory, ebony, white animals, and most importantly, aromatic resins like myrrh or frankincense. The Egyptians needed these products. Myrrh or incense were considered gifts worthy of gods. So this trade prospered in the Middle Kingdom with Egyptian boats sailing in the Red Sea, certainly following the coastline until they reached this land of Punt and traded there. But this route and the knowledge of the location of the land of Punt was lost during the Second Intermediate Period, after the Hyksos had taken the north of Egypt. Hatshepsut ordered and oversaw a mission to reopen this route, which was done and apparently, at the time, considered to be an extraordinary accomplishment of her reign. It was celebrated on the walls of her temple, from which a lot of information about her reign has come to us. On the walls of their temples, their tombs, on the monuments they commissioned, all ancient Egyptian leaders celebrated their accomplishments. They also erased or hid their failures and probably exaggerated or straight out lied, sometimes about their reigns. What is written on the walls of tombs, of temples, even in official records, cannot really be taken for granted, because it was often exaggerated or inaccurate. And Hatshepsut was no exception. To reinforce her claim to the throne, she had a story of divine birth told about her. In this myth, the god Amun would have visited her mother, Amus. Amus would not have realized it because Amun had taken the appearance of the pharaoh Thutmose I, and this is how Hatshepsut would have been conceived, the direct daughter of the most important god of Egypt at the time. And the myth told on the walls of her temple does not end there. Another god from Upper Egypt, Khnum, the god who regulated the annual flood of the Nile and also formed the bodies of human children, would have been called to create her Ka, that is to say, her life force. What does it mean? We have the word soul to name the concept of a spiritual, invisible essence of a person. But the Egyptians did not have a single concept like soul for this invisible essence. They referred to various different parts of what we would call a soul. There was the Ka, the vital essence, or the double, which cannot really be translated directly. The Ka was a connection with the life force, what made a person alive. When your Ka left, you died. But the Ka was only one aspect of the soul. There were others like the Ba, B-A, the personality. There was the Shiut, the shadow, the Ren, which was the identity, the name, and several others of these invisible yet indispensable dimensions that make a living person, that collectively we would call the soul. So the Ka of Hatshepsut and also her physical body, or Khet, would have been created by God Khnum. And then this god and the goddess Heket of life and fertility would have led her mother, Amus, to the place where she would have given birth to Hatshepsut. This myth was elaborated when she reigned, and it was obviously a way of again reinforcing her claim to the title of pharaoh. In the same vein, she had texts on the walls of her temple assert that her father designated her as his successor, which is dubious, probably even a big lie, because if true, she would not have started as a regent. But that was the name of the game, and she was certainly not the first to come up with that kind of lies to strengthen her power. After 21 years of reign, first as a regent, and after a few years as a queen regnant and a pharaoh, it all ended in 1458 BC, when Hatshepsut was 50. The circumstance of this end of reign are also a bit mysterious. A possible explanation is simply that she died of old age. 50 was already a respectable age in antiquity, and she could have died of natural causes, an illness, for example. She died in year 22 of the reign of Thutmose III, her nephew, for whom she started as a regent. And at the time, Thutmose was 24 years of age, well past the point where he should have started reigning. Retroactively, the reign of Hatshepsut was erased from many records, as if Thutmose III had been the direct successor to Thutmose II. Another possibility, but it is purely speculative, was that she was overthrown by her nephew, more or less by force, and killed, or that she died afterwards. An unknown is the type of relation there was between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III as he grew up. Was he impatient to take the crown? Or instead, did they get along and share power in good intelligence or anything in between? We don't know. Thutmose III certainly didn't have a weak character. He proved it after turning into a hyperactive conqueror, a builder, and one of the most glorious pharaohs in the history of Egypt. He is sometimes called Thutmose the Great, and his style was very different from hers. He constantly campaigned on the frontiers and beyond. When Thutmose was still a child, she certainly had the power and the possibility to get rid of him. Accidents or poisoning happen, and yet she didn't. Is it that she didn't dare, or that her moral sense of affection made this option impossible? These are more unknowns, but the fact that Thutmose III reached adulthood and the succession did not alter the peace in Egypt speaks rather well of Hatshepsut's character and skills as a monarch. She left the country in good condition and in order behind her. In the early 20th century, it was generally assumed by Egyptologists that there had been a campaign after her death to suppress her. In collective memory, by walling her monuments, erasing her name, destroying the statues and inscriptions in her temple. And this campaign would have been the product of a society or a political system that couldn't tolerate for a long female monarch. Maybe there was something of this, but this view has been strongly mitigated since. First, as I told you before, because of the realization that erasing the name of predecessors was very common along Egyptian history. It was much quicker and cheaper to steal existing monuments rather than build new ones. And second, because it also appeared that many usurpations or damages to Hatshepsut's buildings did not happen just after her reign, but later, by the end of the reign of Thutmose III. This is not what you would expect if the idea was to erase the female pharaoh as soon as possible. Why wait 20 or 30 years? It could have been a decision of the son of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, who had a somewhat weaker claim to the throne. His father was already the son of Thutmose II, with a secondary wife, and himself was the son of Thutmose III, with another secondary wife. This was a lot of dilution of blood, and as we saw at the beginning, great royal wives were often chosen within the family to preserve the purity of the blood. And so Hatshepsut, with her impeccable pedigree, may have been an annoying figure reminding that, not so long ago, a sovereign with much purer blood than Amenhotep II was on the throne of Egypt. Hence maybe the urge to erase her memory a few decades after her death, rather than immediately after. So for these reasons, the idea that Egyptian society completely rejected a female leader has receded somewhat. A reigning queen was certainly not considered a standard or desirable solution. It was not encouraged, and Egypt, after Hatshepsut, immediately returned to a succession of male pharaohs. But the example of Hatshepsut shows the exceptions were possible and tolerated in some circumstances. For women of extraordinary will, extraordinary ambition, or confidence, and also, maybe, that's at least what the case of Hatshepsut suggests, of outstanding birth. Someone from a lower extraction than her would probably not have been accepted on the throne. 35 centuries later, we are left with few certainties. Hatshepsut ruled for 2 decades, the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom of her time. She built a lot. She made her country prosper, and she left it in good condition. She was most certainly a highly cultured and educated woman because of her birth. Her permanence in power strongly suggests that she was smart, and that she must have been strong-willed to take the throne that was not destined to be hers. But she is also a mystery. We ignore what she looked like. A mummy was attributed to her, but this is very uncertain. We ignore what she thought, who she loved, what she wanted, what daily life was for her apart from the highly deified religious rituals and ceremonies of the court. In that sense, she is not necessarily more mysterious than other pharaohs. But what is special about her is that she may well be the first great woman of history of whom we are informed. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.